Welcome to Authors at Google and Marketing Talks at Google. Today we're proud to present Dave Murray. He is a scientist, an entrepreneur, and all-around pretty cool guy who's come to share his insights. In the past, he's worked in marketing, he's worked as a rocket scientist, and he's been the head of innovation at Intuit. So I'm proud to present David Murray and his book, Borrowing Brilliance.
Thank you. Thanks, good to be here. There were two questions that I asked myself that led to the writing of this book. The first question was, can you teach creativity? The second question was, is innovation a definable process? And the answers to those questions were, yeah, I actually believe that you can teach creativity. And the answer to the second question is maybe, as far as innovation being a definable process. So what I'd like to talk to you about is about answering those two questions, maybe teach you a little bit about what I learned about creative thinking, and then how you can apply it in your business. The title of the book is Borrowing Brilliance, and I named it that because I wanted the title to reflect the primary premise of the book. And what I did is, like Effie said, that I was the head of innovation at Intuit. And it was in that job that I first started thinking about creative thinking as a subject itself. And it's kind of a strange subject. So what I did is I started studying creative thinkers, creative processes. But most importantly, what I did is I studied creative ideas themselves. And I asked myself, what makes a creative idea? How do you construct a creative idea? And in that course, I studied scientific ideas. I mean, I looked at Einstein and Darwin and Newton. I studied business people, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, the Google guys. And in that process of looking at that, I realized that creative ideas are made out of existing ideas, always. I mean, I could always, as you dug deeper in, you could always see the roots of an original idea and an existing idea. And that's why I say that brilliance is borrowed. I think it's why Einstein said the secret to creativity is knowing how to hide your sources. So I was like I said, at the time I was working at Intuit. So Intuit was run by GE people. GE people were process people. So they were like, Dave, you got to make a process out of this. Because I'm not sure it really was a process, and I'm not sure that creative thinking, you can actually define it in a series of steps. But I took that challenge and I started thinking about it. And these are what I came up with. These were the what I call the 6 steps to innovation. And I think about them, I break them into 2 separate parts. And I think of 2 different metaphors to describe them. The first one being the origin of an idea. And an idea is like constructing a house. And that's kind of the metaphor that I used to think about that. The second part is the evolution of a creative idea. And I had to separate them, and I had to have 2 different metaphors because the first metaphor, which I thought was very powerful for the origin of an idea, the construction metaphor, doesn't extend to the process itself, because the process is a trial and error process. So that's why I switched metaphors. And the book is actually broken into 2 separate sections. So let's talk about the origin of an idea and those 3 steps. And again, it's a construction metaphor that I use, and I think it's very helpful to think about it this way. The problem is the foundation of that house. You build your ideas on a well-defined problem. Borrowing then provides the materials to build the solution to your problem. And then you take the pieces and you make something new out of it. You combine the materials that you've grabbed. Let me give you an example. I don't know if we have any engineers in the house, but Isaac Newton dabbled in mathematics, and he created calculus. And what he did is first he defined a problem. He actually defined two problems. Does anybody remember what those problems are? It was, no? The area under a curve and the tangent to a curve. And then he went out and he borrowed some materials to solve that problem. In this case, he went to algebra, trig, analytical geometry, and infinitesimals. And he combined that stuff in a unique way that nobody else had done and created a solution to the problems that he had defined. And that's how he created calculus. And there's an interesting side note about that. Isaac Newton was, after he came out with calculus, he was accused of plagiarism, which isn't unusual for creative thinkers. And he actually had to defend himself in a court of law because somebody else in another part of the world had created calculus at the same time. And it was during his defense that Isaac Newton said, yes, if I've seen farther, I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And what he was talking about, the shoulders that he was standing on were the creators of algebra, trigonometry, infinitesimals. So I think it works in both very complex idea creations, like calculus, physics, scientific, a lot of the problems that you guys work on. And it works in very simple problems too, very simple business problems, marketing problems. The second part of innovation and creativity is the evolution of creative ideas. Ideas need time to evolve. I break this into 4 steps. I mean 3 steps. There's incubation. That's where the subconscious mind, all creative thinkers are subconscious thinkers. The subconscious is really good at doing the first 3 steps, at defining, borrowing, combining. And that's kind of what's going on. So you need to put your ideas away, let them incubate. Then you need to pass judgment on your ideas. You know, I don't know if you guys have a formal brainstorming process here at Google, but my experience is that brainstorming sessions don't work so good because they lack judgment. And you need strong judgment of an idea to figure out what's wrong with an idea so you can evolve it. Judgment is like, you know, it's like the fight for survival in Darwin's theory of evolution. And then finally, the 6th step is the enhancement step. And that's trial and error. Just keep doing it over and over. And sometimes it's just restructuring the materials that you have. In 1820, Hans Oersted, he did an experiment, and he noticed that with wires, magnets, and a compass, and he noticed that when you passed a current through the wire, the compass went haywire. It created a magnetic field. And that was an interesting idea. But 20 years later, Michael Faraday took that idea and restructured it. And what he did is he passed the magnets around a wire and created a current. Now that was a huge innovation. I mean, that's how power plants work now. Like in a hydroelectric plant, a turbine spins magnets around a wire, and that's how we create a current. The point being is, when you get to that last step, sometimes you just take the materials that you have, restructure them, move them around. So let's just dig in. Whoa. Sorry, I lost that. Give me just a second, you guys. Sorry. Well, let's dig in and talk about the 6 steps in more depth. There's the problem step. You know, my experience is that we're very good at solving problems, but we're not necessarily very good at defining problems. And there's 3 parts to the problem step. There's the identification of a problem. There's the understanding of the problem, which is finding out the root cause. And then the third one is describing the problem. And sometimes it's just changing the description of the problem a little bit that'll lead to an innovation. Let me give you an example. I was working with a Fortune 500 company, and the CEO called me in, and there was a marketing group. And he's like, you know, I keep giving these guys the same problem, and they keep coming back with the same answer. We need to get them You know, we need to get innovations out of there. And I was like, well, what we really need to do is change the problem. Henry Ford, back in the 1920s, he defined his problem as building the least expensive car. And he was very successful at that. And all of his ideas were built off of building the least expensive car. William Durant over at General Motors then took that problem and kind of redefined it just a little bit. He said, let's build a car that people can afford. And that, just by changing the definition of the problem just a little bit, led to a huge innovation, which was GMAC. And so what they did is they solved the problem. They built more expensive cars, but people could afford them through monthly payments. So when I work with a conceptual development team, what you guys need to do is keep going back to that problem and keep trying. Just subtle differences in how you define it can change how you solve it. The next step is the borrowing step. And this is where you gather the materials. And I think of this, imagine thinking of this as on a continuum. And what you want to do is the way that you define the problem will determine where you look for your solution. And this works, again, in both simple problems and complex problems. You know, for example, my daughter is studying fashion right now. So she bought a book on Coco Chanel. And Coco Chanel she was named one of the Time magazine called her, excuse me, one of the most influential people of the 20th century. And what she did is she defined a problem. She wanted to liberate women. And that was the problem that she defined. And once she defined it, she said, okay, if I'm going to liberate women, where am I going to look for solutions? And where she looked was to men's clothing. So she combines men's clothing with women's clothing, and that solved her problem. John Nash, the economist from the movie A Beautiful Mind, you know, the way that he developed his ideas is he defined a problem and then he noticed that the problem, and his problem was the looking at or making decisions with incomplete information. And he noticed that, well, that's the same problem that people have in a poker game. So what he did is he borrowed poker game strategies and solved economic problems with that. So what I like to teach is when you're solving your problems, first what you do is you start close to home. If you're a software engineer and you've got a navigation problem, then I would look at how other software engineers solve that navigation problem. Then I would take a step away and I would look at maybe web designers. How do they solve that problem? And I'd borrow ideas from there. And then I would take a step outside of business. How do sailors, truck drivers, search and rescue teams, how do they solve their navigation problems? And then combine all that. And again, that leads to the third step, which is the combination step. You take all these materials and then you combine them to form a new solution. Combination is really the essence of creativity. You know, and it's taking two existing things and making a new thing. It's funny, and this was a big aha moment for me as I was thinking about this and thinking about creative thinking. And I was like, you know, is it really that simple? Is creativity, is a new idea just two existing ideas? And I think it is. And I started thinking about that. And as I was in a meeting actually at Intuit, and across from the table was sitting a friend of mine. And I guess I kept glancing at her and staring at her subconsciously. I didn't realize it until she kind of mouthed the words, like, what the F are you looking at? And then I realized why I was staring at her. Because I kept asking myself the question, well, actually, let me take a step back. I was asking myself the question, what is the most important or the biggest idea in the history of the human race? You know, and I was thinking, is it Einstein's idea? Is it Darwin's? Is it, I don't know, is it Star Wars? And that's when I started glancing at my friend. And then I realized why I was staring at her, because she was pregnant. And I went, aha. I go, that's the answer to the question. That's probably the most creative thing, the most important idea is a new human being. And what is a new human being? It's a combination of two existing human beings. The fifth step, or I'm sorry, the fourth step is incubation. That's when we bring the subconscious mind into it. And I think you need to, all creative thinkers have a very strong relationship with the subconscious mind. And I work hard with myself to try to establish that relationship. And I do three things. And I think about it in three ways. It's input to the subconscious mind. So that's when I tell my subconscious, okay, this is my problem. These are some of the borrowings that I have. And then here are some interesting, unique combinations. And then I just put it away and give it time. The subconscious mind is kind of like a parallel processing computer. And it can make all these combinations behind the scene. The third part, and this is probably the most critical part, and maybe the hardest part, and that's output, listening to the subconscious mind. As I discuss this with a lot of people, I notice everybody has the shower experience, the aha moment in the shower. And I wondered, that's kind of weird that everyone's having that same experience. And then I realized why. The morning shower is one of the few times of the day when your conscious mind isn't like a flutter with information. You're kind of relaxed, it's in the morning. So in other words, you're not thinking at all. And that gives the subconscious time to have something to say. The ideas pop in. And I think that's why the ideas keep popping in. In the book, I talk about how you can kind of simulate that shower experience. The fifth step is the judging step. The judgment is so critical because without it, your ideas are going to be frivolous and useless. I think what I do is I separate my judgment into two, maybe three areas, but two primary areas: positive judgment and negative judgment. And I use the problem as the criteria. And I think it's not judgment of whether you like the idea or not. It's judgment, what do I like about the idea? And what don't I like about the idea? And there's a magnificent side effect that you get when you start doing that, and it's creative intuition. Because what you get is as these ideas start flowing and you start passing judgment, positive and negative, you start being able to describe an idea that doesn't exist. It has these attributes from your positive judgments, and it doesn't have these other attributes from your negatives. Steve Jobs, who, if anything, or probably his greatest creative attribute is his creative intuition. He knows a good idea when he sees it. And he's also notorious for having a contrary personality. In other words, he's really positive one moment and really negative the next moment. And I think that's what gives him the creative intuition. He's able to say, I really like these points and I really don't like those points. You and I are never going to be Steve Jobs. I think it's innate in his thinking. But if you start doing it consciously, making those two different positives and negatives, you'll start to develop it too. And then as you're going through like your work and stuff, you'll see an idea and you'll be like, oh my God, that's the idea that I was looking for. And then finally, there's enhancement, the enhancing step. The creative process is a trial and error process. And ideas need to evolve. Products need to evolve. In the enhancement process, you're basically going back and you redefine your problem, you reborrow materials, you recombine and restructure, and you come up with the next iteration of the idea. I think Facebook is probably a good example. Facebook started out, the original conception of Facebook was basically borrowing the Hot or Not site at Mark Zuckerberg was a freshman at Harvard University, and he started a Hot or Not site where you would rank incoming Harvard freshmen. He borrowed the name Facebook from, that's what they called, they actually printed a yearbook where you could look at the faces of the incoming freshmen. And now, but if you look at the evolution, so that's where they started with the idea, and now they're like, 250 million users. They've just passed MySpace. They just keep evolving. They keep working on it, keep redefining, keep restructuring their problems and their solutions to the problems. So there's, any questions? I think we've got some books in the back. I'd appreciate anybody's like to buy if you could. Oh, we got a question.
All right. Well,
okay.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for speaking with us today. It's a very awesome talk. In the creativity research and the literature, the two big questions that come to my mind are, like, first, how you can sort of create creativity. Like I envisioned somebody telling me to, like, be creative, and then that's kind of difficult. And then also I was wondering if you could comment on the role between similarly between creativity and control, like how you should ramp in instead of, like, letting things get too blue sky in order to make forward progress.
Right.
Thanks.
Well, and that's an interesting point. I think there's a paradoxical intention to creativity. That thing where do it, and then I think that's because we use our subconscious minds to come up with ideas, and when you demand something from your subconscious mind, it'll tend to, like, shut you off. The way that I think that you come over that is you start doing things consciously. In other words, when you can't come up with an idea, you go back and you say, okay, what problem am I working on? All right, there's the problem. Okay, what materials do I have to? And you start doing it consciously, and then your subconscious then will pick up on it. Does that make sense? Okay.
So again, thank you so much for coming. Another question for you. When you've mentioned these different areas that people have borrowed from, they tend to be, well, they are sometimes seem very different from the area in which they're trying to solve the problem, like the poker example. Can you talk a little bit about tips perhaps to get people thinking in sort of broader ways without just going, again, off the deep end?
Yeah. I mean, I think it all comes back to the problem. You define the problem, and then you look for places with a similar problem. The reason John Nash went to the poker game is because he recognized that poker players were making decisions with incomplete information. And he's like, wait a minute, that's the same problem that people in the economy have. And once he recognized the same problem, then he was able to borrow from it. So that's, I think, the key to it is how you define a problem, and then you go to places. And I actually think of it on a continuum. I start close to home, then I do something similar, and then I look really far away. So, if I'm a business person, I'm looking to science. How does science solve a problem like this? And then I'll borrow ideas from there. If I'm a scientist, I might look to business and see how they solve it and kind of swap it out.
Hey,
Yeah.
Thank you as well. I've kind of a related question.
Yeah.
I remember BMW or, like, other car manufacturers, for instance, looking at biology or the nature to improve their products. For instance, for wires, for their tires, they look at frogs' hands and see why are they sticking so well to objects. If I think now, I mean, I'm working in marketing, and if I would think to looking at the nature or problems in the nature, it's such a huge area. How would you define a process or some kind of way of approaching such a broad area to improve your own problems or work on your own problems?
Right. And I think the answer to that question is, again, it comes back to the problem. There's a whole branch of engineering called bionics, and they look at, I think people studied the lotus flower because it repelled water. So then what the scientists and what the business people did is said, what's going on there? And took ideas from that and created products out of it. So again, it really comes back to, this all comes back to the problem. How you define it will determine where you look. Does that make sense? It's not just random places out that you borrow. You borrow from similar places with the same problem.
Thank you for the talk. Extremely interesting. So your slide relates to an individual and its supposed process.
Yep.
You know, like in going in a creative direction. Let's put it that way. But could you expand a little bit, you know, like in a typical corporate setup? How would each one of these steps be supported by, say, a larger organization? How do you give, you know, like what do you need to do? What do you need to put in place for individuals to actually be able to sort of have less friction in going through these 6 steps?
Yep. So let me make respond to that in a couple ways. So I believe the creative process does take place in your own mind, and the ideas are going to come from your mind, and that's really what my book is about. The book is a personal book, and I tell personal stories, and I get into my own mind. Now, with that said, understanding the creative process and how it works does translate into how you would create processes at your company. So, for example, I would separate these. I mean, I would when I brainstorm or when I'm in a concept development team, we will separate and we'll just work on the problem, and we will brainstorm. We won't talk anything about solutions. It's just pure defining problems in a hierarchy of problems. I mean, problems don't exist in isolation. There's high problems, low problems. There's a whole bunch of, you have internal problems, external problems. So I'd separate that. I'd look at the problems. Then I would do another meeting where I'd pick out a couple problems and I'd say, let's send everybody out and find places outside of our business that are solving these kind of problems. And we would send the whole organization out to look at that. People would come back in and then present back. So we would do the second step. Then we would do brainstorming. And then maybe even in a separate meeting, we would do judgment, where we'd bring in some, usually the top managers are usually really good at judgment, at telling you why your idea doesn't work and telling you why your idea might work. So, the incubation thing, that's a real personal thing, but it also means that, we have to understand that our ideas are going to take a little bit of time, and we need to work on them a little bit. So, any other questions? Cool. Well, thank you, guys.